Before we get going on today's show, I want to remind everyone that the Kickstarter campaign for Bard Song, the 7th novel in my ongoing heroic fantasy series, The Glimmer Chronicles, is currently in progress. We've passed the initial funding goal and are now speeding towards stretch goals. So if you like what I do here, like my stories, please go to michaelkingswood.com/bardkick and consider backing the campaign. Hi friends, it's Michael Kingswood and it's story time. It's Saturday, so it's time for another edition of Story Saturday. As advertised last week, we are continuing on with our stories that wrote last year as part of the 52 Stories in 2023 project. This is the 8th one. It is called Crowned Emperor. Well, it's the 8th one I wrote. It's the 7th one in the first volume. But anyway, this is a science fiction story set in my area of my science fiction universe that's called the Korathi Empire. It is what it sounds like. It's an empire in space. And I initially started writing stories in it a number of years back. The concept was, what if Prince Lotor from Voltron didn't know he was in the evil empire? And how would he, right? It's just his empire. And what happens if he wasn't actually a bad guy and then found out that it's an evil empire? And then what would happen from there? So the first story set in this setting was called Veritas Morte. It's a novella. I've written a number of other short stories. Several of them were in this project from last year, several of them earlier as well. This is a story about the day that Crown Prince Lucian, gets crowned emperor, and the party that happens when that happens. It's kind of a fun thing. I hope you enjoyed it. I enjoyed writing it. Here we go. The crown that now marked him as emperor and protector of the chosen was only a few tens of grams of platinum mixed with silver. Lucian Bandamere knew this. But when the high priest placed it atop his head during the culminating moment of his coronation ceremony, when he officially took on the responsibility for guiding and protecting the lives and fortunes of the hundreds of millions of people on the 36 worlds that made up the Korathi Empire, it felt as though it weighed 10 times that. 100. The high priest's words washed over him, but he barely heard. Not that he needed to. The words were rote ritual, used for a century or more and well known by everyone in the imperial court. Still, it struck Lucian that he really ought to pay more attention, out of respect, if nothing else. Strange how that consideration weighed so heavily on his mind. A few months ago, he wouldn't have been concerned about whether or not he had shown the proper respect for the elderly priest, even if only within the confines of his own head. He was the high priest, certainly, but his origin was lowly, the 5th son of a minor house 6 jumps from Korra that Lucian only knew of because he had been forced to learn every house in the empire, not because they actually amounted to anything. Not so long ago, Lucian would have had trouble separating the man's lofty position from that lowly beginning. Before the campaign in the Neo-Nova system, and Minister Emerson's betrayal, and the revelation of his own father's sins as a result. Now he couldn't help but think perhaps people from the lower ranks were more worthy of respect and attention, or perhaps just that trusting and respecting them held less danger than the higher houses. Foolishness, he couldn't just cast aside the great houses, and with them all the ministers and functionaries who made the empire's apparatus function, if not smoothly, at least without too terribly much strain. But as he walked from the throne room in the imperial palace on Korra, for once not even noticing the crystalline ceiling resting apparently weightlessly atop the lofty fluted columns that lined the sides of the chamber, or the pinkish blue sky and puffy white clouds floating past in the sky above, he could not put that thought from his head. Abernathy, his longtime teacher and advisor, dressed as always in his cowled gray robes that matched the hair on his head and the beard that lined his chin, walked beside him and half a pace behind to his right. His honor guard, Marines in full formal regalia, led the way, and his train of functionaries and lesser advisors followed. And he felt alone. It had been a long 4 months since he called an end to the Corellis campaign, ceasing the fighting in the Neo-Nova system after his father's death. 4 months that had been filled full. Preparation for his father's funeral and interment, dealing with the legalities of dividing the late Emperor Archibald's personal estate between Lucian and his sister Emilia and her husband, Count Poderick of Heaven's Gate, restaffing the ministries, especially in light of Emerson's treachery, to ensure the loyalty of the new ministers, planning for the coronation and now the coronation ceremony itself. 4 months that passed in a flash, and with seemingly not a moment to just think and absorb all that had happened during that time. Now it was done, and Lucian was emperor. And as he passed through corridors that Lucian knew so well on his way to the grand hall where the post-coronation feast was to be held, corridors he had run through and played in as a child and then later walked as a young man, so that they were as natural and familiar to him as his own body, he noted not one of them. His entire mind roiled with uncertainty and doubt that he could not let intrude into the mask of calm assurance that he put on for others to see. He wasn't ready for this. He had not yet reached his 20th year, had not thought to take the throne for decades yet. No one had ever sat on the throne of Korra at such a young age as he. He was not ready, and yet here he was. Could he even do this? Or would he end up a footnote in history, Lucian the Fallen, whose failure presaged the downfall of the Empire into competing and warring satrapies, easy prey for the surrounding powers to snap up? Powers like the Sago dominants, who had taken Hazador mere weeks before his father's death at Emerson's hand. He saw Abernathy looking sidelong at him as they walked together, a little bubble between the two of them and the rest of his entourage. Still, his teacher's words were hushed, barely carrying to Lucian's ears. Abernathy knew better than Lucian how even an idle word could reach an enemy's ear. "One step at a time, Your Majesty." The word struck through the doubt flooding Lucian's mind like a rapier thrust with expert aim, though the tone was warm, almost companionable. It broke Lucian's dour reverie, reminding him that he at least wasn't completely alone. There was one man who would always have his back. Lucian flashed him a quick smile and a nod, and Abernathy returned the nod. Moments later, they entered the reception hall. Lucian had waited in the throne room for the others who filed over and got situated as the director of ceremonies and protocol dictated, so that he would be the last to enter, as was fitting. Still, he had to wait at the tall, black-stained double doors that led into the reception hall. 2 attendants in the formal livery of the imperial chattel, one for each half of the door, stood waiting with their hands on the doorknobs, their heads turned toward the side where one of the protocol director's assistants, clad in a white kimono with a blue sash, waited with his left index finger pressed to his ear, to a communication bud worn there, no doubt. His eyes, gray-brown beneath shortly cut red-brown hair, met Abernathy's for a moment. Abernathy's questioning expression elicited a raised finger from his right hand, as though to say, "One moment." That moment stretched into a smaller eternity, and Lucian was tempted to shout at him to get on with it. But right then he perked up and looked away from Abernathy to the servants at the doors. He nodded, and they pulled the door open toward Lucian and his entourage. The room beyond was smaller than a stranger to Korra would have thought it would be, considering the size of the Empire and its wealth. Maybe 50 meters on a side and 7 or 8 meters high. It was made from the same pinkish-gray stone that had been carved into fluted columns at intervals along its walls, supporting a vaulted ceiling that was painted with murals of glorious scenes from Korra's past, going all the way back to the time of the split with Old Terra, now long forgotten in the murky past. Starships and hard men abounded in those murals, hard men who had the same slightly hooked nose as Lucian and his late father, who all wore their hair in the style of the crown, closely cropped at the sides and top but left to grow long in the rear. Lucian's hair followed his father's black curls, but not all of his ancestors did. A few were blonde, one was a redhead, but the cut of their hair, so severe and yet almost undisciplined in the way that the long tail flowed, was all the same. A mark of Lucian's office even without the silver platinum diadem now adorning his forehead. The room was lit by dangling chandeliers made of gold, each of them holding half a dozen light elements on long curved arms that cast a uniform, warm glow throughout the space. Dozens of round tables set for 12 stood arranged in evenly spaced rows, topped by charcoal gray tablecloths that matched the uniform Lucian wore. The rows ended at the royal purple carpeting that stretched from Lucian's doorway to the raised dais on the far side of the room, on which a long VIP table stood, adorned with a tablecloth of the same shade. Lucian's destination. The attendees of the feast were all standing behind their assigned seats. Many of the men in the crowd were dressed in military attire like Lucian's, except that while he bore the imperial purple in a sash that went from shoulder to hip, their sashes depicted their branch of service: sky blue for the fleet, crimson for the Marines, deep green for regular army, and yellow for air and space forces. Others wore the blue formal kimonos of the imperial court. A few toward the edges of the room wore white, matching the protocol mans inside the doorway. Lower-level personnel in the various ministries who still had somehow managed to rate an invitation to the event. The women in the crowd wore gowns that varied as much as the women themselves varied from each other, demure, usually on the older ladies, all the way down to almost slinky on some of the younger, in all shades of the color spectrum, except for purple. As the doors finished swinging open, a fanfare of trumpets sounded from unseen speakers, and Lucien's marine escort marched forward in unison, their boots marking time in measured unity as they dispersed along the carpeting from the door to the VIP table, pairs of the liveried men stopping at intervals along the way so that the cohort ended up lining the entire route Lucien was to take. Then they turned as one, facing each other crisply and bringing silver-polished repeating rifles that each had borne at port arms down into a stiff and uniform present arms, in a single movement that halted as quickly as it all began. The anthem of the Empire, strings accompanied with throbbing bass drum with a single trumpet carrying the melody, began playing, and Lucien walked down the line of stony-faced marines to the place prepared for him. Abernathy followed, as before, at his side and slightly behind. The rest of the entourage waited. He felt the eyes of the waiting hundreds following him as he walked, his shoulders back and his head high, in the marching gait he had learned almost before he knew how to read, his expression as stiff and imperially regal as he could force it beneath the weight of those stares. How many of this group secretly wished for his failure? How many would give honest support? How many simply did not care, except to the extent that it would affect their own petty fortunes one way or the other? Far too many of the latter, Lucien knew from a lifetime observing the goings-on at court. Far too few of the second. And as to the first, though his spies knew of some plots, and some rumors of plots, it was impossible to tell for certain. It sent a shiver up his spine. The VIP table was full, the assigned guests waiting behind their chairs for Lucien to sit first. He recognized the heads of the various ministries, and Lord Morsey as chamberlain, as well as heads of the military branches. Amelia and her husband, a man 10 years her senior, who was starting to go gray at the temple, sat to the left of Lucien's seat. Her gown was imperial gray with a purple sash about the waist. Her curly black hair, the same shade as Lucien's, hung loosely about her shoulders, and she beamed a smile when their eyes met. Count Poderick's nod, when Lucien looked from his sister to him, was perfectly formal and proper, but Lucien thought he saw a flash of warmth in his eyes for a second that came close to matching Amelia's. His kimono was the standard blue of the court, but boasted a brooch on his left breast, showing a shining sun above a closed set of golden gates, the sigil of his star system. Diplomats from the surrounding powers sat further out along the table. His eyes lingered for a longer moment than he had intended on one of them in particular. She was tall for a woman, and slender but curvy, in a modestly cut gown of deep scarlet that was tantalizing for all that it was the epitome of good taste. Her hair was black at the roots and down to the sides of her face, but dyed to gray and then scarlet to match her dress at the ends. Her eyes flashed with intelligence, and when they met his, her lips turned upward ever so slightly in greeting. Ophelia Temison, Princess of the Capistrani Republic. Lucien knew she would be here in her parents' place, and he had both looked forward to and dreaded seeing her again. He forced his eyes away and looked to her right, where at the end of the table the former Prime Minister of the Free Republic of Hazador stood in the dark blue suit of Republican cut and a thin silver-gray necktie. His dark eyes were sunken, like he had not been getting much sleep, and Lucien couldn't blame him. He'd been working tirelessly to try to get assistance for his people, a diaspora of refugees now scattered throughout the Empire and some of the surrounding systems. He had also been lobbying hard for the Empire to assist them in retaking their system, and from the frank and not-so-friendly way he returned Lucien's look, he didn't appreciate the nose Lucien's father had sent through the channels, and the same nose Lucien had continued to send since his father's death. At the opposite end of the table from Hazador sat the ambassador from the Sago Dominance and his wife. He had on a green high-collared silk coat that was embroidered with golden dragons around the collar and the cuffs of his sleeves. Her dress was silk and matched his shade for shade. His head was bald, his goatee deep black, and he had the angular eyes that shouted his Han bloodline even if his status as a high-level representative of the Dominance wouldn't have made that obvious. Hazador and the Dominance were a powder keg, even being in the same room together, but there had been no good way to not invite either of them. As Lucien rounded the table, passing the Dominance's ambassador on his way to his chair in the center, he couldn't help but think they should have found a way, and no matter if it ruffled Hazador's feathers. Dinner was sumptuous. 5 courses beginning with spiced duck soup, followed with a salad of greens, dressed with a raspberry vinaigrette, then chicken and beef in a reduction sauce that somehow managed to bring out each meat's separate flavors without overpowering either of them. Then more greens atop a mash of some sort that Lucien couldn't identify, but left his tongue reeling from sweet to hot back to sweet again. And then cheesecake, topped with cherry sauce, Lucien's favorite dessert from when he was a young boy. Fortunately, there were no speeches this evening. There was to be dancing, however, and by tradition, Lucien was expected to give time to all comers of appropriate rank. Very quickly he found himself swept up in dance after dance with one young lady of the court after another. One and all were winsome, if not beautiful, and all were obviously trying to court his favor. Lucien couldn't blame them. He was unmarried, not even engaged. Every family in the empire would want to pair a daughter with him if they could manage it. Politics. As he was dancing with one dark-skinned girl, the daughter of House Menel, Lucien flashed back to one of his last conversations he had with his father the morning Emperor Archibald had been poisoned. The Emperor had revealed that he had been considering an arranged marriage between Lucien and Ophelia Temison, and Lucien had rebelled against the thought. He looked into young Miss Menel's face as they danced. She was probably 2 years younger than him, so just past her ascendancy, and saw past the friendly and respectful smile on her face to the trepidation in her eyes that she almost but not quite managed to bury beneath a noble facade. And he wanted to tell her he knew exactly how she felt. He could not, of course. They all had to play their games of decorum. In point of fact, she was rather pretty. Lucien was certain she'd have no end of suitors that she actually wanted. Their dance ended, and he retreated a half step, bowing from the waist. "Thank you, Miss Menel." She smiled at him, and this time it was fully genuine as she curtsied. "Your Majesty," she said, and then she turned to go. Relieved, no doubt, to be done with it. Lucien sighed and turned around, and found himself face to face with Ophelia Temison. Her eyes twinkled, with amusement or something else. There could be layers to her that were hard to read. He had learned that well enough during their first meeting. Ophelia didn't bother with a curtsy. She just stretched out her arms into a dancing pose. "May I, Your Majesty?" Her tone was completely proper, her smile friendly, but Lucien sensed some teasing there as well, or maybe something else. He stepped forward as the band began their next song, taking her right hand in his left and placing his right hand on her hip. "My pleasure, Your Highness," he said, and she laughed. As they moved across the dance floor, passing a mass of other dancing couples, she glanced left, then right, and her smile grew a little more broad. "Everyone's watching, you know." He snorted softly and bent forward to place her into a dip. "Of course," he said. "You have a reputation for trouble." She laughed again as she straightened. "That's not it." Her eyebrows rose. "The handsome young emperor, unmarried and ripe for the snatching up." That twinkle just intensified, and the teasing was plain now. "Every powerful family in your empire is aching to get their daughter's hooks into you." That she was paralleling his thoughts from just a moment ago somehow was completely unsurprising. "The emperor must do his duty for the empire," he said, keeping his tone polite and friendly, and not taking her bait. He sent her into a slow spin, then stepped in to catch her at the end of it. "Secure in air and all that." "Of course." She pursed her lips, looking thoughtful for a moment, then gave a little toss of her head, making her colorful hair flare out in time with their bodies as he glided her into a turn. "You know, my parents thought about trying to pair us up," she said after a short while longer, and Lucien almost lost his footing from the shock. A lifetime of training helped him recover almost as soon as the moment took him, but she noticed. Of course she did. That teasing smile returned again, and the twinkle in her eyes expanded still further. "What better way to make sure your big mighty empire doesn't gobble little us up?" She said it lightheartedly, but he knew that was a very real concern for her republic, and not just hers. "I told them not to bother," she added after a second, as they pulled apart and released hands for a moment. "You're not your father." 6 months ago, that would have stung, enraged him. But he knew the truth of how his father had manipulated and conquered his neighbors, the ruthless tactics he had used to do so. Another thing he had learned from Neo Novus. It still wasn't something he liked to hear, though. He stepped back into her and turned her to the left, not trusting himself to reply for a moment. "And besides," Ophelia said, her smile turning from teasing to sly, "I reminded them you'd already met me, and that was enough to convince them the chance was already ruined." Whatever bite her comment about his father had made, Lucien found himself laughing out loud at that. The song ended shortly after that, and he stepped back from her. He wasn't at all surprised to find he had legitimately enjoyed their dance, or to see that she had as well. "Thank you for the dance, Your Majesty," she said, and she did curtsy then. "Your Highness," he said, bowing in return. Next followed a string of young maidens from more houses than he cared to count. A few were charming. One was quite striking, but they became a blur so that he found himself almost dancing on autopilot, repeating the same answers to the same questions from different mouths, and becoming dreadfully bored. So it came as a bit of a relief when Amelia left Poderick's side to take a turn with her little brother. They were silent for a little while. He just looked at her. It appeared she had healed from the shock of their father's death, at least somewhat. Poderick had reported that the news had very nearly crushed her, that she had become despondent, not eating and barely sleeping for weeks. Lucian was 6 years younger than her, but he remembered how Emperor Archibald had doted on her. Whereas Lucian was the heir, to be molded and forged into the man to rule the empire after he was gone, Emilia was his prize, and she had loved Archibald far more deeply than Lucian imagined he ever could have. It was more than a father's love for a daughter, Lucian supposed. Looking at Emilia now as she moved with him across the floor, he was struck by how much she resembled their late mother. Especially as she grew ill, and after she passed, it must have felt to Archibald like Emilia was a lifeline to the woman he'd once knew and loved. Or maybe Lucian was just speculating. Regardless, though he could still see pain in Emilia's eyes, she hid it well beneath outward happiness for him, so it was an improvement. "You looked like you enjoyed your time with Princess Ophelia," she said all of a sudden, and he blinked at her in surprise. For a moment, that hidden sorrow fled completely beneath amusement as she leaned in slightly. "You should have heard Lady Telemund gripe about it. She wants her Sibylline to nab you, you know." She raised an eyebrow at him. Lucian had to hold back a shudder. Of all the maidens he had danced with, Sibylline had stood out as the most attractive, but also the most unpleasant of the bunch. "No chance of that," he said, firmly. Emilia chuckled. "I assumed as much." A moment later he spun her, and when they came back together in a close part of the dance, she leaned in, and her tone became soft but insistent. "Poderick says all is in readiness." Lucian nodded, and his mind went into overdrive. He had promised himself to change the direction his father had turned the empire toward, to deal more honorably with the other powers and with his own people. But Archibald had been steering his course for decades, and riding a ship of the empire's size would not be easy. Lucian had approached Poderick with the first set of reforms he intended to make after taking the crown, with the hope that the Count would line up support within the noble houses, so his initiatives would not be dead on arrival. He might be emperor, but his word would matter little if no one would actually follow through with his orders. That Poderick had been successful meant that the initial pieces Lucian needed to commence his work were ready, just in time. Lucian looked over toward the VIP table, where most of his ministers still sat, talking amongst each other. If all went well, these next few months would see many of their worlds upended, and they would not be happy about it. Some of them. Maybe most of them. Hopefully, some would see past their own self-interest to the greater good his new policies would create for the empire and its people. It was going to be a fight either way. "Thank you for me," he said, and Emilia nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else for a second. Then the moment passed, and she nodded again. Then the song was over, and it was back to the stream of maidens. Lucian sighed inwardly, but kept up appearances, and did manage to have a bit of fun here and there. All the same, as the evening drew to a close, he was happy to be done. Abernathy walked at his side as he strode down the corridors toward the Emperor's apartments, his apartments, on the other side of the palace from the reception hall. A pair of marine guards led the way a few meters ahead, and another pair trailed. "Poderick's ready to go," Lucian said to his teacher, and Abernathy nodded. "Then all is in place," Abernathy said. He paused. "Are you sure you want to take this course?" Lucian scowled at him. "We've discussed this." "I know, Your Majesty, but once you've begun, it will be too late to reconsider if you have any doubt." "None." Abernathy returned his look in silence for a moment, then nodded. "I will put the word out." "Good." Ahead, the corridor turned to the right. 20 meters further along would be the door to his apartments, and rest. Lucian could hardly wait. "It looked like Princess Ophelia was pleased to see you again." Lucian stopped. It took Abernathy 2 paces to realize that he had. The old man turned to look back at him with an eyebrow raised. "Your Majesty?" "Don't you start on that too, Abernathy. I had to hear about it from Emilia already. Last thing I need is 2 women gossiping at me about her." Abernathy's lips twitched into a half-smile, half-smirk for a second. "She is an impressive young lady, Your Majesty. You could do much worse." Lucian just stared at him. After a moment, Abernathy's reserve cracked, and he let out a little chuckle. Then he nodded his head. "As you wish." "Thank you." But as he closed the door to his apartments, Lucian could swear he could still hear Abernathy chuckled as he walked away to his own quarters. Lucian groaned. Okay, so fun little party to start off the Imperial Reign, and of course, teasing political stuff that's going to be happening on and on as we continue with more stories. And some other conflicts that have already been talked about in previous stories have been continuing through. The Hasdor stuff, the dominant stuff. But when we talk about stories involving Lucian, it's going to be obviously a lot of political stuff. Much more to follow in this setting as time goes on. This setting is actually in the same universe as my Icaran Confederation Navy stories, just in a separate part. And at one point, maybe they'll meet up, maybe they won't. We'll see. But it's a big, intricate web of creative coolness that I like. And it's coming together a novella at a time, a short story at a time, and a novel of a time, and a novel at a time. I'm as soon as I get the Kickstarter for Glimmer 7 fully squared away and when finish the fulfillments of that, or at least the final edits and stuff of that book, I'm going back to a novel that I wrote in the process of writing for the Confederation Navy. And that'll be going on, coming out later on this year with another campaign. But like I mentioned, the Kickstarter that's going on right now, I told at the beginning of the video, if you haven't yet checked out that Kickstarter campaign, please do it. Go to it. The Glimmer Chronicles is a very fun fantasy series. People who have read it all tend to like it. I like it because I wrote it. That means you're going to like it too. So go check that out. michaelkingswood.com/bardkick for the Kickstarter campaign. Appreciate it. We've already hit the first goal, but there's more goals we want to hit, right? Mo money better. Speaking of mo money better, go buy some books. michaelkingswood.com/store is the direct sales link where you can bypass all the middlemen, get books directly from the writer that you like and want to support, namely yours truly, and you can get any style you want, pretty much any format you want, nice and easy. You can, of course, go to all the other stores, Amazon, Apple, Barnes & Noble, Kobo, Google Play, billion other places. michaelkingswood.com/books to read the number 2 will get you to Universal Book Link aggregator that'll point you to whatever store you want. That'll be great. Other ways to support the channel, help keep the lights on around here. We've got the subscribe star, which not a lot really going on with, but would like to get something going on there. So follow the link over to michaelkingswood.com/subscribestar, and you can show some recurring support there if you wish. Otherwise, make sure you have liked this. If you're not subscribed to the video channel or the podcast channel, make sure you do that. Tell all your friends about it and come back next week. Next week, we are going to do the next story. The next story is called Miss Melody and the Jail Cell. Miss Melody's Cafe is a portal fantasy setting that I write in periodically. People go into the cafe and then they go through the portal and get insights or solve problems or just have cool little adventures. So we'll be doing that next week, the next little story in that. I think that's all we've got for that. I think that's all we've got for this week. Thanks for swinging by Story Saturday. Come back next week and we'll have more fun. And don't forget to go buy books and back Kickstarter campaigns. All right. Talk to you next time. Until I do, sheesh. Don't do anything I wouldn't do.